The higher dimension force is a phase transition and phase conversion accelerating force causing a paradigm shift. This means that when the HD force operates on something or someone, either it operates on matter or organisms, it causes the acceleration of phase transition or even phase conversion. It changes the function of what it is operating on. This is not acceleration as the rate of change of velocity with respect to time. This is totally different and could have different mathematics describing it as well. This is basically accelerating the phase transition or conversion by introducing new information to the operatee, which is the thing the HD force is operating on, or in other words, to the wave function of the operatee. This information will lead to a paradigm shift in the operatee and a change in its core function. Let's talk about the notebook thought experiment to understand the suggested mechanism of entanglement of the higher dimension force, the HD force, which is not necessarily quantum entanglement, as suggested in the book, The Big Defreeze of the Universe Analogies and Thought Experiments. The analogy could be used to understand the mechanism of the unified complex forces HDBR3. Additionally, the analogy will help in understanding the two worlds interpretation proposed in the book, The Big Defreeze of the Universe, Analogies and Thought Experiments as well. The analogy goes that we have a notebook of, let's say, 120 pages of holographic two-dimensions films. These 120 pages would be representing our multiverse, so all the possible universes are within this notebook. There might be other notebooks with different stories, but this is beyond the target of this analogy. If Alice, which is standing outside the notebook, looks at the two-dimensional holographic page of our universe, she would not be able to tell what this thing is a hologram of unless she shines a light on it to see the three dimensions representation of reality of this holographic film. So technically, Alice is outside the space-time of this holographic film and, she would be shining light from outside it. Now, what if she wants to change the coding or the information on that holographic film? Well, Alice from her location just cannot change the code on the two-dimensional holographic film. Yet, according to the two worlds interpretation presented in this book, Alice actually has a second version of herself in our universe's page on that holographic film. The second version of Alice can, change the code using the mechanisms proposed in the straight line analogy project on the total space, which will then be projected back on the base space, which is, well, our universe. Some of the operations suggested for the HD force, like scaling and projection, in addition to entanglement, could, honestly, be a good candidate for the tools she can use to shine a light on the two-dimensional holographic film, as well as the idea of changing the code on that two-dimensional holographic film through her version in our universe. Now, this could as well start from a one-dimensional representation of reality, as suggested in the straight line analogy. Another question would inevitably come up: what if she wants to transfer codes, information, or even energy between the 120 pages? Well, this could probably be done as well if we understand well the operations of the three imaginary complex forces: the higher dimension force, or the HD force, the balancing force, which is the B force, and the retrieving force, known as the R force. The primary operations of these forces are, well, as follows. The higher dimension force, or the HD force, handles scaling, projection, entanglement, and paradigm shifting. Then there's the balancing force, known as the B force, which is all about resonance. And finally, the retrieving force, or the R force, takes care of creation and annihilation. The complex forces can actually be unified and act together as well on an appareil, as explained in the next section of this book. If we manage to reach a good understanding of which operation can be used to do which function, we would probably be able to transfer data, information, and potentially energy between the 120 pages of the notebook. So, in addition to shining the light and changing the code from outside the space-time of the notebook, there are primary operations of the forces at play here. What is time in the notebook thought experiment? It's a question that honestly challenges the way we usually think about time itself. If we refer to the two worlds interpretation presented in this book, Alice would have another version of her in the universe coded on this holographic film. So, Alice isn't actually controlling her version of our universe, she's just, shining a light on the holographic film so that it can be represented in 3 dimensions of space and, well, so that time can have meaning. From Alice's frame of reference, everything is really happening, or has already happened right now, including the big defreeze, if that turns out to be correct. That means the Big Bang, inflation, the formation of galaxies, evolution, and even the end of the universe all sort of coexist in her perspective. But, Alice isn't actually interested in all that, since her main job is simply shining a light so that her version of our universe gets represented in 3 dimensions. She might not have the ability as well to shine a light except on the section of the holographic film where her second version's information is coded. Bob happens to be shining a light on the holographic film for his version of our universe to get represented in 3 dimensions simultaneously when Alice is shining a light. Basically, their versions in our universe would perceive time as a function of the flow of events, which gets represented in 3 dimensions as a result of shining the light from their other versions. So an almost unavoidable question comes up. What happens to their versions in our universe when they die? But, that does not mean that the information of their versions in our universe got erased from the holographic film. Charlie comes at a later stage and shines a light on his version of our universe to reconstruct it in 3 dimensions. So, could the information of Alice and Bob be reconstructed? Well, that's an interesting question, and it really makes us think about the nature of information itself. Would they have the ability to measure or observe the other scenarios so that these scenarios will actually happen, or at least, some of them? It's a pretty fascinating idea to consider. Entanglement as a mechanism for the HD force. Now that's a concept that opens up a whole new way of looking at what might happen after death. Resonance is expected to be one of the mechanisms of the balancing force. But we can still figure out the mechanisms by which this force operates, and entanglement could be a very good candidate. Unitarity is the quantum equivalent that tells you that you can always reconstruct the past from the future. We actually lose information because we lose the ability to follow the details, not because the information itself gets lost. The evolution of systems, well, it can be represented by matrices. So, let's consider a system of a field of wave functions evolving just as we would expect, and then a paradigm shift was introduced to it by the HD force, which, interestingly, could be through entanglement. Another analogy would be human beings as a highly sophisticated measuring apparatus for the universe with a very high Q factor. An entanglement happens between us, the measuring apparatus and the field of waves. If we develop the mathematics of the HD force and the complex forces in general further, we could track and measure such entanglement. The two worlds interpretation introduced in this book proposes another approach for this idea. The mechanism of the HD force's entanglement. So the HD force's entanglement will not be limited to a specific number of states. Partial entanglement could be allowed, which means that the two entangled systems could be partially entangled, in a sense that some of the properties of one of the systems or fields could be entangled with some of the properties of the other system or field. Fading of entanglement could be allowed and tracked as well. So, the HD force could actually choose to pass the information to an imaginary particle or field which, isn't really limited by our usual space-time parameters. The paradigm shift operations and effects caused by the HD force, well, they really do open up a whole new way of thinking about things. One of the main operations or effects of the HD force is, as expected, a paradigm shift for the operatee. So, in order to explain the expected nature of these paradigm shifts and really what should be considered as a paradigm shift caused by the HD force, as well as what should not, we'll use the analogy of human beings in evolution. For example, in this analogy, natural selection shouldn't be considered as a paradigm shift caused by the HD force, even if, different species evolved from common ancestors, and the new species have new functions and different abilities and skills. In my previous book, Quantizing Emotions, the Basic Mathematics of Psychology, some of these behaviors were introduced as what could be called UCIB, or the Universal Collective Impact Behaviors. These include things like seeking knowledge, sharing knowledge, and implementing knowledge in the form of innovation and invention. The idea here is that biologically, humans have followed the evolution process through natural selection, yet, mentally, or at the conscious level, they have faced a paradigm shift that could be through an operation by the HD force that we could potentially figure out its mathematical tools and mechanisms. Another example of the paradigm shift caused by the HD force could, come from our straight line analogy. Conservation in the higher dimension force, or the HD force, is something we really need to consider here. It is expected that the HD force does not violate any conservation laws, and potentially some in the form of energy that could be referred to as the HD energy. This added information or energy are not governed by space and time limitations of the operatee. Then the laws of conservation would apply to the new information or energy introduced to the operatee. For more information about the higher dimension force and its proposed mathematics, please check out the book The Big Defreeze of the Universe: Analogies and Thought Experiments. Conservation in the higher dimension force, or the HD force. It is expected that the HD force does not violate any conservation laws, and potentially some in the form of energy that could be referred to as the HD energy. This added information or energy are not governed by space and time limitations of the operatee. Then the laws of conservation would apply to the new information or energy introduced to the operatee. For more information about the higher dimension force and its proposed mathematics, please check out the book The Big Defreeze of the Universe: Analogies and Thought Experiments by Mohammad Hasan Algarhy.